Our guest today is the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois. He has been a federal prosecutor for 20 years and began serving the Northern District nearly 8 years ago. Our guest today is the top federal law enforcement official for the 18 counties across the top tier of Illinois, with a population of roughly 9 million people. He gained national recognition by prosecuting the United States versus Osama bin Laden case following the bombings of the embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. Chicago Magazine has called him the, and I quote, mob-busting, terrorist-chasing prosecutor from New York City, tapped as the outsider to clean up the town, unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, Patrick Fitzgerald.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'd like to perhaps give you some of the punchlines at the beginning about why I'm here. I'm here to talk about violence and how it is that the people in this audience may be the more important answer to the problem of violence than you think the people I represent are, and that people always look at the problem of violence as a purely law enforcement problem, and you think I'm going to give you the magic answer this afternoon, and part of the magic answer may be turning to you for both participation in ideas and efforts by the business community. I also want to say that people may wonder, why are you out here going to be talking about hiring felons in corporate environments? Why would you think that's a good idea? Why aren't you back in your office arresting people? Isn't this the worst time in the world to be going out asking anyone to hire anyone, much less to ask anyone to hire people who have criminal records when there are people without criminal records who don't have jobs? And I'd like to address all of that in the course of my remarks, and if I miss one, don't be afraid to ask. I think we ought to start with maybe a little perspective on the problem of violence in Chicago and its bittersweet news. I'll give you a few numbers to put things in perspective, but back in 2001, the year I started here, I think the homicide rate for that year, there were 667 people killed. And following that year, the homicide rate got a little lower the year after, and I think in 2003, the number was about 601. And that marked this 36th straight year that more than 600 people were killed in Chicago, which is a remarkable number. And at that time, law enforcement, federal, state, local, all wanted to reduce the homicide rate. And the goal was to think about breaking that number 600 for the first time in 36 years. Something remarkable happened the following year in 2004. The homicide rate went from 601, past 600, past 500, and down to 454. It was remarkable not to go under 600 for 36 years and then go down to 454. Way back in 1992, the homicide rate was double, 943. So that was a good sign. From 2004 through 2007, the number of people killed in the city ranged from about 450 to 475, all well below that 600 number that was a platform for almost 4 decades. Then last year, the numbers went up significantly to 511, back over the 500 mark. And now, so far this year, we're about 20% down in terms of the numbers so far this year. Now, let me qualify that in 3 ways. First of all, numbers tell you something, but behind every number is someone who was killed. So it's a good thing when the numbers go from 600 to the 400s. Well, that's still 400-something people killed every year, which is absolutely unacceptable. And when you look at the per capita rate, you compare Chicago to New York or LA, the numbers are usually more than double the per capita rate in other cities, which tells us that the numbers have to go even lower. And you also have to recognize that so far this year, the time of year when the most homicides occur are during the summer months, which are ahead of us. And if you need any more else to put it in perspective, it's the fact that so far this school year, 36 children of school age have been killed. And that wakes us up. And if you're wondering why I'm coming to talk about hiring felons in jobs, it's probably the worst time for people to ask people to think about that. But if our answer is it's a bad economy, so we'll deal with it later, This is the worst time to kick the can down the road on the question of violence, and then turn on the TV every so often and hear about an awful murder and say to ourselves, how could that happen? Why don't we do something about that if the solution that's staring us in the face is one we've kicked off because we're in rough economic times? With that to start, you may wonder, why isn't this a law enforcement problem? And one of the things, and it is a law enforcement problem, but law enforcement is a key part of the solution, but is not the solution. And sometimes I greatly fear that people give too much credit to law enforcement for lots of things. In the process of doing that, they take too little responsibility for themselves. Because in putting credit on law enforcement, you put responsibility on law enforcement in that box, and people can step back and say, someone ought to fix that problem. Or if they do a good job, give us too much credit, or think that it's something outside society's control. If there are numbers that should bring home that law enforcement cannot solve this problem by pure incarceration, let me point out that if Jody Weiss were here, and you'd recognize him, he looks like he's wearing a bulletproof vest even when he's not. He represents more than 13,000 police officers. And if you think about that, when they work 5 days a week and work 8-hour shifts, there are maybe 4,000 police officers on duty at any one time. And the estimates of gang membership in Chicago range from 70 to 100,000 gang members. How in the world can we incarcerate our way out of the problem when we're outnumbered that much? And anyone who thinks that either the state's attorney's office or the U.S. attorney's office think the answer to this problem is incarcerating everyone who's a gang member with a gun has no idea of our capacities. We can't do it, we won't do it, and we don't want to do it. Every year, more than 10,000 guns are seized off the streets of Chicago. And if that many are seized, how many more are out there? So what we have to recognize is law enforcement has to focus its resources, and I'll talk briefly about what we're doing. We have to focus our resources on going after the worst of the worst, the people most likely to be violent, the people most likely to kill others, and go after them and prosecute them. But within that, that's a limited amount we can do. What we have to do is address the underlying problems. And no one is pie-eyed about how serious it is when there's a lack of family structures in many communities, there's lack of community support, there's lack of jobs, but there are things that we can do that I'll talk about in a moment. Briefly, let me talk about what law enforcement is doing. We are trying to do our cases selectively and try to focus on the people who are most violent. The lion's share of the work is done by the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, who do a larger volume of cases. We do cases, and we work together. And what we do with gun cases in particular is we do joint intake. And one of the remarkable things I saw was when I was in New York, we had 5 state's attorney's offices equivalent in one city with 1 special prosecutor and 2 U.S. attorney's offices. So with 8 prosecutors' offices in one city, there were sadly times when you would see rivalries getting in the way of doing things better. And I won't say that in Chicago rivalries get in the way less often. I'll say something stronger. There just aren't rivalries. People are sitting around a room and there's not an issue. The state's attorneys don't find out that the U.S. attorneys have grabbed a case because we're more interested in it. The assistant state's attorneys and assistant U.S. attorneys sit down together with Chicago police officers and ATF on gun cases and decide which one fits in the state system better, which one fits in the federal system better, who's the most violent, which system will give the most penalties to this person, and what's appropriate. It's a joint decision about which there have been 0 disputes, and that's remarkable. In addition to, and one thing I focus on, one of the elephants in the room is we have to recognize that when we're talking about prosecutions and talking about inner city violence, there's the issue of race, and we can't pretend it's not there. The large majority of people who commit violent crimes in the city are male, and an awful lot of them are African American. We also have to recognize the large majority of people killed in these violent crimes are male, and many of them African American. And if we look past the direct victim, the person who shot, and look at the people who are just as much victims in many senses, the people in the neighborhoods who are afraid to go to work, afraid to go to school, afraid to cross the street, afraid to let their kids play in particular neighborhoods, those are not in the Gold Coast. It's not in Lincoln Park. It's happening in Englewood, North Lawndale, and back in the yards. It's my belief that we can't ignore that problem. But we have to recognize that there is that dimension to the problem where we don't want the community to think that law enforcement is there to sort of select people out for prosecution. We have to have the community trust that people are there to reduce violence. But given that overlay, we have to make every special effort to make sure that anything we can do to lessen violence, short of incarceration, is something that we should do. One other thing I would point out is that we have some special programs working with the Chicago Police Department, FBI, DEA, ATF, State's Attorney's Office, and the U.S. Attorney's Office, focused particularly on a gang strategy where on a monthly basis, people are sitting down in different areas and figuring out who are the most violent gangs, who are the people causing the most violence in a particular area, and what law enforcement is doing about it. It's sadly remarkable to me how open those meetings are, where people sit around and the Chicago Police Department will say where they are in an investigation. Each of the federal agencies will say where they are. The federal agency that's the farthest along will take the lead, work with the Chicago Police Department, and will either decide it's going to go to the State's Attorney's Office or the U.S. Attorney's Office, or we'll split it up and do both. And that, to me, shows you that we're working together as well as partners as we can. And that's where it really comes to is we've achieved the law enforcement partnerships without an issue. But we have to recognize that we're just one leg of a three-legged stool. We need the community and we need the corporate community. We have to expand that partnership. And let me tell you in concrete terms one example of what I mean. One of the things that we've been doing is having what we call parole forums. And parole forums, about 20 or 30 people who are released from Illinois Department of Corrections, felons with records, are brought into a room, and they meet there with assistant state's attorneys, federal prosecutors, Chicago Police Department, and ATF agents, and they're told what I call the stick speech. They're told, we know who you are, we know you have a record, we're going after people with guns, and if you're caught with a gun, it's going to be referred to us, and we're going to look at this for federal prosecution. And then they're given often examples of people from their neighborhood that are recent and what happened to them when they were caught with a gun. So there's no illusion that they first learn in federal court that they're going to see 15 years without parole for their offense. They're told at this meeting. And it's basically a very blunt, sharp message about what will happen if they break the law. And following that, there are people from the community. There are people who talk about drug detox programs. There are people who talk about GED programs. There are people who talk about job training opportunities that are available if people want to not go through the door of going back to the gang life. We want to go through the door of saying, I made a mistake, I paid my price, and I want to try something different. And to be honest, the most remarkable people in the room are the ex-offenders who come to speak. And often when law enforcement talks, they look down at the floor a little bit, and then when the community service providers, they look up a little bit more. And then an ex-offender walks in, a former gangbanger, who tells them in very blunt terms what their life was like, why it was wrong, and why they want to go straight. And what's remarkable to me is that we wanted to make sure that we did this, that was having some sort of impact, and we wanted to see if we could measure it. So we brought in some academics who were involved with the University of Chicago, Columbia, Yale, and UMass Amherst. There was a couple of them moved around between those institutions, and asked them to study it. And what they found is sort of remarkable. After several years of looking at these forums, where the people who went to these meetings were compared to the people who didn't go to these meetings. And the meeting lasts 1 hour. If you did not go to a forum, the odds are that if you were released from prison in Chicago, that within 3 years, more than 50%, slightly more than 50%, were back in prison. If they went to the 1 hour forum for that one meeting, within 3 years, the rate at which they were back in the prison was slightly less than 25%. And holding for other variables, the rate of recidivism for the people who attend a 1 hour meeting drops 30%. 30% less likely to reoffend. Now, I could sit here and tell you that it's the great advocacy of the assistant state's attorneys or assistant U.S. attorneys in convincing them in a 5-minute speech that they shouldn't break the law, but I know that's not the case. And I know it's some impact from how the message is delivered, but it's remarkable we can make that much impact in 30%. But what it also tells me is I think we may have perceptions of people who are coming out of prison that just aren't true. People have the Willie Horton typecast. If you're coming out of prison, you have a record, then you're just done for life. You're going to be a criminal for life, go anywhere near a person like that, and you're just dealing with danger. And you know what? There are some people in the room who are going to come out of prison, and they had left the gang life with guns and drugs, and they have every intention to return to the gang life of guns and drugs. There are other people in the room, obviously shown from the 30% figure, who are not happy with where their life's at, recognize they made a mistake, and want to turn it around. And some of you may be thinking, that's great. And if I'm in the business community, how do I know which one I would get if I hired someone on one of these forums? And that answer is actually very easy, because it's a very easy example. If at the end of the meeting, someone is told, you know what, there's someone over here at a table, you can sign up, and on Monday, you can take a bus across town, go to see that office, and learn how to do manual labor. Well, you can go and learn how to do electroplating, and you'll be paid so much an hour, or you'll be told how to rehab a computer, and you'll be paid $9 an hour or $10 an hour, and you better be careful because some of these jobs are dangerous. The people who just want to go back to a certain street corner, sling crack, protect their turf, and get in fights with other people with guns have no interest in getting up on Monday morning at 9 o'clock and taking a bus across town to try to get training for a job that will be difficult to do. They may lose their street corner. For the people who have recognized this life isn't for me, there's not a great future, it's violent, I go to jail, and want to turn it around, will get up and do that. And so the trick in the 30% number is a recognition of who we're dealing with, that lots of people in that room want a choice. And what has frustrated me is looking at that and thinking, well, we should do more forums, and we're trying to do more forums. But we have lots of the sticks. We need more of the carrots. And I think it would be a true shame if one of the reasons we had continued violence in this city was that we try to do an effective job, amateur as we are at being sort of marketers, marketing to the people coming out of prison that you have door number one, which is the old way you were living life, and door number two, which is being a productive member of society. And a whole bunch of them were convinced that, you know what, I had to go through door number two. And they got there, and they tried to open the door, and it was locked. And that's why I'm here. And so if we're looking at where we're going to go for the future in terms of how we're going to make an impact, we have to recognize that we have an awful lot of our population in the city includes people who've come out of prison. And those that go to those meetings and turn around and say, I'm going back to gangbanging, and I'm going back to my Englewood block, and I'm going to show people how tough they are, that is our job. Look to the CPD, look to the state's attorney's office, look to ATF, FBI, DEA, and my office to do their job with those people, and we'll continue to do it. But we have to recognize that there's a whole lot of people out there who do want the opportunity to do something different, and we're negligent if we don't think about ways that we can do it. One of the concerns I have is that there's probably a lot of people who sit around and think, you know, that's a really, really good idea for some other company to do, or a really, really good idea for somebody else in my company to suggest, and this way, if it all goes bad, that's their job. And I think we have to recognize that there are people out there doing it already. There are companies who've been doing it for a decade. I went to one foundation a week ago and saw a number of companies that have been doing it for 10 years and are very happy. Some of them are coming out more, for lack of a better expression, and talking about how they're hiring people with criminal records. But I think if people had concerns, the one thing I would ask people to think about is whether or not they want to find out more. Find out more about what those companies are doing, what their experiences are, whether awful things have happened or not. One of the things I learned from one of the foundations is that most of the companies that hired aren't so much interested in doing it, you know, purely for the sort of public good. They're interested in getting employees who will be supervised by a foundation and be reliable and be cheap. They're actually looking at it for business reasons. And the more we can get the people like you in this room who may have business opportunities to think about that, or the people in this room who have good ideas about different things we ought to do, to be open to doing that, that's where we're really going to make the biggest impact in the homicide rate in this city. And I would also add that one of the things we have to do is focus on youth before they go to jail. And I think sometimes we don't appreciate how much we can make an impact on young kids who are teenagers who think they don't have a future, who think jobs aren't open to them. I remember growing up in a very different environment, a working class environment, but I remember the first time I wore a suit and tie behind a desk, and I just thought, this is a joke. They let me sit here and they put my nameplate on the door. You know, this can't really be real. Think about that in a community where, you know, it's very different. And allowing high school students to work as interns and come downtown to Chicago, walk into one of those big buildings and work at an office and make them think that that's realistic, that's probable, what an impact people can make. My suggestion is that if people want to be open to some of these ideas, we have a website. It's, I can give you the address. It may be on one of the handouts, www.psnchicago.com. But for me, if you want an idiot-proof way to remember it, if you just Googled PSN, Project Safe Neighborhoods, in Chicago, the first website that comes up would be that. And we list a lot of different community service providers we work with, ranging from people dealing with youth issues, people dealing with hiring of felons and reentry, people doing different programs, community service providers. You can log on to their websites. We can't vouch or formally endorse them, but you can look to see what they're doing. If you'd rather do it a different way, we have a coordinator who can talk about different opportunities you might do. Many of you in this room are probably doing things already. Maybe one thing you'd want to know is where is the most help needed? You know, if you were in the movie theater business You wouldn't want to build a movie theater next to another movie theater. Bad business. If you were interested in making an impact in some of the neighborhoods, you might want to find out where do we have the least resources. You might find out that we have a lot less in Englewood than we have other places. So where can you make the most impact? But my suggestion is that we all want to recognize a safer city, and we all get very, very upset, as we should be, when we hear about children being shot. But we can't always work back on the micro level and say, why was that particular child shot by this person carrying a gun who was mad at some other guy and shot at him and missed, and some child got shot? And that's a law enforcement job to work that case backward. But the real issue is how many people are out there with guns, how many people are out there with lack of opportunities. And if we can get the 30% in those meetings who want to change their lives and provide them an opportunity, we will reduce the homicide rate in not just a way that affects numbers. And I will leave with this thought. In October, before I take questions, but in October, an envelope will be opened and we'll find out whether Chicago 2016 is the host city for the Olympics. And a lot of people will be excited. If you've read the book Devil in the White City, when Chicago got the World's Fair, how excited people were. So a lot of people will sit around in October and wait for a good answer in Chicago 2016, which is a fine thing. But come October, we'll know how the summer fared. We'll know how many people were killed. We'll know how many more school children were shot. And that's a number that's important for Chicago 2009. And so, well, I'd like to thank all the law enforcement who worked very hard on this issue, and we'll step it up in the summer and work very well together, encourage us to do more and to try to do it more smartly. I really think the answer is in this room, and the answer is not from law enforcement just doing its limited best to pick out the most dangerous people to incarcerate. We've got to take those people who are trying to go straight and let them know that there are chances to do something else. And anyone in this room with ideas, with energy, anything else to sort of donate to the cause, I would encourage them to do it. I would encourage them to find out more information. I'd encourage them to read the newspapers and see stories, if you do, about companies that have hired felons, taken a chance, and been happy. Because that's really, one of the key solutions long-term to reducing the violence rate. And with that, I'll take questions.
Many of the questions have nothing to do with your talk. I don't want you to talk about conversation. We have people with the questions, and all the questions so far, except for one, deal with something that the U.S. Attorney has not talked about. So I'm not going to ask him questions of past cases or pending cases. I know you're groaning, but that's the deal. Mr. U.S. Attorney, what is the organizational framework for your effort?
I think it's multifold. I think on the organizational framework, we're just doing the law enforcement piece with gun cases. That's the State's Attorney's Office and the U.S. Attorney's Office working jointly with CPD and ATF, and they just sit down, and an assistant state's attorney takes their cases, reviews them, looks for candidates for federal prosecution, and then they sit down with us and we decide that. On a gang level, law enforcement sits in a room monthly in different areas and decides where we ought to focus the resources and how to coordinate. But on a bigger level, we also, you may be surprised to know this, when we sit around and decide where we're going to concentrate law enforcement efforts, we look at where the communities are. About a year ago we had, or last summer, we had a trial of a gang in Aurora. And when this gang in Aurora was indicted, there have been a lot of shootings, mostly by underage teenagers. And there was a plague of violence in Aurora, and ATF went in there with the local police department, and we decided to do the case federally, jointly with the Kane County State's Attorney's Office and our office. And remember, during the trial, I woke up to a radio announcement that the first homicide of the year had occurred in Aurora, and that announcement was in September. And that was a remarkable testament that if you arrest the right people in the right circumstance, you can lower violence. But frankly, we've also seen cases where we've made arrests, and there's still violence in an area, and that's because there's a lack of an infrastructure to step in. Gangs are often a support system for people who have nothing else. And if we remove a gang and there's no community support organization, there's no church, no school, no alternatives, then often what you will do is simply open up territory for a new gang. So we actually look and say, we sit around with the police, and state and federal look at it together and say, what resources are there on the community side? And you know what? There's a group there that if we went in and took that gang out, someone will step forward and fill that vacuum. So we have a thing called CAGI, Comprehensive Anti-Gang Initiative, and as part deterrence, part prevention, and part of it is reentry. And in that structure, we do have federal funds that are given out, and for all sorts of complicated legal reasons I won't explain because I don't understand them. We have some structure, but we use the umbrella of PSN a lot, and that umbrella is it's on the website, but it's a way in which we have people, other foundations linked up with us that we can be sort of a gateway to.
This is from B. Cole. What about government offering some kind of indemnity insurance to businesses who hire people with prior conviction records? How else can business take the risk?
I think government does, and that's what I think you need to go to one of the foundations, because I've learned that there is some indemnity bond that's provided that's backed by the government, and I'm not an expert on that, and so I won't pretend to be, but I can tell you that the people that are in this business, this isn't their first rodeo. They've actually thought about lots of these things, and they have plans in place that I can't fully explain, but if you were to link into some of these foundations and call these questions, they would not be surprised by any of them. What do you do? Who's violent? How do you prevent this? What if this goes wrong? What about indemnity? And I've been briefed on it, and I listened, and I was very impressed, but I'm not as familiar with it to tell you the details, but I do believe there is an indemnity program already.
Next question, Paul Dorsick. How does your office work with nonprofits, such as Heartland Alliance, to help, this is the city club, that always sneaks in, to help those with criminal backgrounds find employment?
And again, for legal reasons, we can't be a sponsor of any particular organization. And so what we try to do is we do get federal funding, and people apply for grants. And so to the extent that we get grants, and they say, last year I think we received $2 million, and I think of a third of it was to go to sort of prevention, which was general education efforts, and we underwrote people going into schools. For example, there's a group who called In My Shoes, and they are people who were shot and are now in wheelchairs because of the gang violence, and they walk into a school, or they wheel themselves into a school classroom and talk to children about what it was like to be in a gang, what the violence was like, and what it's like to live in a wheelchair. And there's something, as you might imagine, remarkably powerful about that presentation that brings it home. The folks who do it are in disability. There's a limited amount of money they can make without losing their disability, so it's incredibly efficient as well as being effective. And so different organizations like that apply for grants, so sometimes we have federal grant money. The other thing we do is we try to keep aware of them, and we link to them on our PSN website, and you can see what there are different groups focused at youth, focused at reentry, job training. So we try to work, one of the things I'm trying to do, frankly, is since people look at us as the law enforcement people and wonder why we're talking about this alternative approach, is hoping to open people up to thinking about it. So we work hand in hand, but we don't endorse, and we sometimes, another branch of the government funds them in part.
Miller? Linda Miller, right in front. What? Linda Milt. What have you heard from the companies that have come out on hiring? What makes them feel safe about coming out? Any downside?
I obviously went to a luncheon where people are still hiring, so I guess that's a self-selecting group of people who are still hiring 10 years later. And my best sense is, rather than ask me, is that if people link into these websites, to these foundations, there's a video out there of testimonials by prior employers. One of the things I'm hoping is that employers who do this will be sort of more vocal about what they're doing. But my understanding is that it has worked out well for a number of people, and I would encourage people to sort of look the gift horse in the mouth, go right to the source, the people who have employed people with criminal records, and ask them directly.
This is an anonymous question. To what extent have we seen an escalation in violence as a result of the assault weapons ban being lifted? Is there a correlation?
I don't have the expertise on that to give you an answer, yes or no.
Oh. Take a little longer on that one, I could. A little pressure up here, one mistake and I've seen these guys in action. How can we use the 1-hour forum model to prevent crime in school programs? How can we change our prison as punishment system so that younger inmates can leave the system in better shape?
Well, we do have more focus on youth. We do go into schools, and we do have probation reforms, which actually we do expect would be more effective. I think one of the things I saw about the parole forms were that they were a lot more effective with people who were not serious gang members, and they were a lot more effective with people who that was their first offense. And that makes sense. If you've had more offenses and you were deeply tied to the gang, you're trying to break a stronger bond. So when you take people who are on probation, which means they haven't been gone to prison, they've been given one last chance, you'd expect that to be more effective. So after the parole forms got off the ground, we started probation forms. We do have orientation programs in the schools. And in mentioning the partners, I did leave out that IDOC, Illinois Department of Corrections, is a key partner in this. They're the ones who get people there, and we work with them. I'm not an expert on prisons and what they do, but I can tell you they're a key element of what we're doing in PSN.
Okay. This will be the last question. There are a lot of questions, personal questions and questions about previous cases, and this is the all-time record for questions that have nothing to do with what the speaker said, though they're really good questions, and I'd really like to hear the answers myself. Just being honest, Mr. U.S. Attorney. All right. But this one's from our own Teresa. And some of you know what this means, some of you don't. Are you ready? Is there beer in the fridge?
There is, and that's an old joke, which I will explain. I had an old trial partner, and we had a long trial, and it was going on and on and on, and sometimes I'd leave him notes on a little Post-it on my table, which, if he was asking someone a question, he'd come over and I'd say, why don't you ask him, was it, June or May when he claimed to have done that drug deal or something? And so it was a long trial, and it was one of those just long week, and I was just trying to think ahead. Most trial days, you're thinking ahead on Monday to Tuesday. Is the witness going to be here? Are we going to do this? Are we going to prep this witness? But this was the last day of the trial week, so I wrote my little note, but I think he thought it was a coach question for his cross-examination, so he walked over to look down at the little Post-it, and it was, is there a beer in the fridge? And I was just planning what we would do when the trial day was over, but I will never live that down.
How a round of applause.